A Necessary Being by Octavia E. Butler. The events in this story occur prior to those of Survivor, the third in the Patternist book series. It was written in 1970 at the Clarion Workshop and sold to the author's friend and mentor Harlan Ellison for his unpublished anthology, The Last Dangerous Visions. It was posthumously published in Unexpected Stories in 2014 when Butler's agent announced that she had discovered 2 new unpublished stories. Read by Darrell T. Smith II for my channel, Quasar Spectra. A Necessary Being. The Rokon How, Tahne, was sharing her evening meal with her chief judge and discussing the current drought when she first learned of the foreigners who had entered her territory. There were 3 of them, not traveling north or south over the long strip of coastal desert as she would have expected, but coming from the east through the foothills. Apparently they were following the narrow dwindling river that had in better times kept Tahne's people well supplied with water. The hunter who brought the message described the foreigners as a huntress, a judge, and, startlingly, a young How. Tahne looked sharply at the hunter when he said it. "You're certain that it was a How and not just a high judge?" "So the message said, Rokon How." And the man quoted, "The foreign How is male and very young, perhaps even too young to have been acknowledged by his people. His coloring is unmistakably pure blue, and he is much taller and larger than the judge who was with him." Tahne heard this silently. Her face turned away from the hunter. She felt just the beginnings of dread as she began to believe the report. A stupid child How, out almost alone on land that belonged to her people. What could his own people have been thinking of to let him wander around so unguarded? "How far is he from here?" she asked the hunter. 2 days, perhaps 2.5, Rokon How. "He's traveling slowly. He had just emerged from the mountains when a group of our hunters saw him and sent word back to us. Since he is coming toward us, our fighters could reach him from here in only a day. Is there any possibility that he saw our hunters, saw them signaling us, perhaps?" Tahne had trouble keeping the hope out of her voice. Even a young How would have the sense to take his friends and run if he realized there were other Kon in the area. He would not know whether Tahne's Rokon were hostile or friendly, and he would not be foolish enough to wait and find out. If only he had seen her hunter's light signals. He could not have seen them, Rokon How, the hunter assured her. "Our hunters made certain that both he and his friends were asleep when they sent their message." The hunter seemed proud that members of his caste had acted so carefully, so correctly. He added, "Our hunters also ask that we hold our answer until we receive another signal from them, so that we don't accidentally alert the How and his party." Thorough hunters, Tahne thought bitterly. A tribute to her insistence on training and discipline. Her body whitened and became slightly luminescent. This was a sign of the approval that she should have felt but did not feel, a sign to the hunter that he and his fellow hunters had done well. "Is there anything more?" she asked. "No, Rokon How." Tahne let the light go out of her coloring, let her normal blue return, and the hunter, understanding that he had been dismissed, turned and left her apartment. She sat still, ignoring the silent chief judge who sat beside her and staring into the fire of the large fireplace. This particular judge was a friend as well as the top official of her government. She had had liaisons with him before his marriage and after the death of his wife. He was a good companion. But she wished beyond expressing that she had not invited him to eat with her this particular night. In another moment he would speak and say the things she did not want to hear. After a moment the chief judge's normal blue-green coloring soared to brilliant white luminescence with his joy. "At last, Tahne," At last! The words came out in a harsh whisper. We must send more fighters, judges, to capture him before those hunters frighten him away. Tahne watched him silently, knowing that his elation would soon be shared by the rest of her people. Another How at last. A young one to be the successor that her body had been unable to produce. A child who could probably be captured without the danger and loss of life that would be involved in capturing an experienced adult. With his youth, the chief judge said, it might even be possible to persuade him to accept the Rokan as his people without the usual coercion. Perhaps, said Tahne. She knew that this was a vain hope, that there was no possibility of persuading a How to betray his people other than by the brutal, traditional methods. But she knew, too, that the words had been meant as a kindness. This judge, more than any other, understood how deeply she hated the traditional ways. She longed to see the young How. She had not seen one of her own kind since the death of her father 20 years before. She had felt her loneliness agonizingly right after his death, but she had been very young herself then, just acknowledged by her people. Her loneliness had passed, or she thought it had. She was surprised at the new loneliness, the desperate need she felt now, need that she knew was in conflict with her fear for the boy, with her hope that he had already fled. But no matter what she hoped, she had to assume that he had not escaped. For the sake of her people, she had to plan his capture. She spoke to her chief judge. We will obey the conventions in this, Ehre. The How and his party are to be brought here unharmed, untouched if possible. They are to be treated as potential friends, not as prisoners. They're to be convinced that we're only being cautious with them. If we can make them understand that, well, then they'll be careful not to do anything that might make us turn hostile. We can't be too gentle with them, Ehre said. We can't take the chance of their escaping. Take a large enough force with you to prevent their escape. Take as many fighters, both judges and hunters, as you think you'll need. But remember, the point is to give them no reason to risk trying to escape. Ehre stared at her. You want me to go after them, Tahne? Would you rather I send someone else, someone with less knowledge of the How, someone who will lose this boy? He considered this, then gave the slight flash of white that indicated agreement. For that matter, he said slowly, you should go yourself. You won't need me if you do as I've ordered. The words came out more sharply than she had intended, and she knew that Ehre would notice. He looked at her silently for several seconds. You've been alone for a long time, Tahne. You should welcome this chance to capture another How. The people need him, not me, she said shortly. They'll have him. They will if I can catch him without your help. A moment ago, you didn't even think you were needed to make the capture. A moment ago, I hadn't thought at all. I'm thinking now, though. A How. We'll need you, Tahne. If he decides to leave his friends, escape alone, we may lose him no matter how many fighters I have. He won't do that if you give him reason. We How don't particularly like abandoning our friends, even when it's necessary. Ehre laid a hand on her shoulder, and she felt the pressure of it heavily. We, Tahne? Already we? You must have been more lonely than I thought. She said nothing. By refusing to go after this boy, you are giving him a chance to escape. I'm giving you a chance to prove that you deserve your high position. The words stung him as she had intended them to. She saw yellow flicker in his coloring and was pleased. It was better to have him angry and defensive than to have him beginning to doubt that she was acting in the best interests of the people. I am not How, he said quietly. I cannot perform How duties, nor will you define How duties. His yellow flickering stopped, and to her surprise his coloring faded toward gray. Gray was for the most private and deeply felt grief. "This is an ordeal that both you and the boy must bear, Tane." Erhe spoke very softly. "We're close, you and I can see the pain that you think your harsh words hide. I understand your sentiment, but the people can't afford it." Tahne let some of her own gray come through bleakly. "All right, Erhe, we'll stop snarling at each other. It's meaningless anyway. I've already made my decision. Gather your judges and hunters and go capture the young How. You must come with us." Her blue returned at that, returned harshly metallic, a cold, threatening color. She said nothing to Erhe. She only looked at him. He understood that he had gone too far. He rose silently and left her. When he was gone, she sat still for a long moment, then bent over slowly, very slowly, until her head touched her knees. She rocked back and forth, still moving with agonizing slowness, and her body became a deep gray. Once she spoke the name of her father, loudly, sharply, as though she were asking a question. But the dead were dead. Death was an end. She neither expected nor received guidance. But she did call to mind the memory of her father, sitting on his mat, lying on his pallet, sitting in the litter that the people had used to carry him. She had never seen him standing. He had been old when she was born, and his legs had been useless for 2/3 of his life. The Rohan had had to follow the tradition when they captured him. He had refused to renounce his former people, the people from whom the Rohan had stolen him, as a How was duty-bound to refuse, and the Rohan had had to cripple him to prevent his ever returning to them. They had burned him with hot irons behind his knees until his lower legs were permanently useless. He had been bitterly vengeful at first, and his agony until his burns healed had helped him make the lives of those who had chosen to serve him hard. Finally, though, as both his physical pain and his emotional anguish receded, as he saw that those he abused and tormented never struck back, he had begun to make the adjustment that some captive How never made. He had admitted to himself that the Rohan had not acted out of cruelty, but out of severe need. They had been without a How, and that had made them desperate. A Khon tribe without a How was a tribe in the process of dying. Even a captive How, who might remain forever hostile, was a symbol around which the people could gather, and thus was better than no How at all. Without a How, people had no purpose, no direction, no unity. It was remarkable that the Rohan had even been able to work together across the lines of caste to capture him. He had finally accepted their need as sufficient excuse for what they had done to him, and he had ceased to fight them. He had accepted liaisons with women of their judge caste, and one of these women had borne him a How daughter, Tahne. He had given advice that had proven good and valuable to the Council of Judges. Finally, the people, seeing that he had accepted them, acknowledged him as their leader instead of merely a symbol of their unity. He had given them years of good government. He had been a better leader than any tribe had a right to expect of a captive How. Only Tahne's memory of his legs marred her picture of him. She remembered the way he had propelled himself with short handheld sticks in the wheeled cart that he had had his artisans build. Sometimes, however, within the privacy of his apartment, the cart had been too awkward, and he, not wanting to ask for help, had dragged himself on his hands and knees, unwittingly embittering his young daughter, turning her against the tradition that had so disabled him. Even now it was painful for Tahne to remember him crawling. The Tekon How Dayut and his party had followed a narrow river down from the mountains, detouring only when sheer drops made it necessary. They watched the land beyond the river grow drier and more barren as they descended, while the river itself grew narrower. Vegetation, except in the vicinity of the river, became tough and spiny, and Dayut had to show Je and Chea the ancient map he carried so that they would be certain they were still on the old trade route, still on a trail that would support life. Once they saw, however, that the trail was outlined in green, a pro-life color, they did not complain about the poor hunting or the increasing heat. They did begin traveling at night, though, at Je's suggestion, and their hunting improved. By the time they reached the foothills, Dayut knew that he was close to the ancient ruins that had been his excuse for traveling so far from his mountain home, his people, and his new How responsibilities. He knew, too, that in spite of the map he carried, he could pass by the ruins without seeing them if he was not careful. Even when the desert dwelling was new, it must have been well camouflaged. By now, unless it had begun to cave in, it would probably be almost indistinguishable from the various hills and mounds that were normal to this area. It was because Dayut was watching so carefully for the ruins that he spotted his captors before Je and Chea saw them. He was alarmed, but he gave no sign to his friends until he had looked around very carefully and seen that the three of them had walked into a wide, remarkably well-camouflaged circle of fighters, a circle that was now beginning to move with them. Dayut's immediate reaction was humiliation. He had been quietly, efficiently captured by a group of hunters and judges. He could see them as though they were uncamouflaged, now that he had been alerted to their presence. But he should have seen them before he walked into their midst. He should have seen them before he led Je and Chea into their midst. He looked at Je, saw that the young judge was just discovering his captivity. Je's coloring had not changed. He did not look around wildly to give notice to his captors that he had become aware of them. But in his eyes, in his movements now, there was an animal wariness that had not been there before, and Dayut knew that he was looking for a break, a flaw in the circle, an escape route. The wariness was even more pronounced in Chea. She was a high huntress, and using her speed and camouflage to escape predators too powerful to kill was second nature to her. Dayut spoke to them both very softly, knowing that he might not only be overheard by his captors, but also understood by them. The Tekon dialect was very close to the ancient imperial language that all Khan tribes knew. Dayut had seen for himself that strangers picked up his language very easily. Je, he whispered. Chea, be still. Don't resist. The two relaxed cautiously, then glanced at him, perhaps wondering how sure he could be of himself in a situation that he had faced before only in training. Dayut thought he saw doubt in their eyes, and he turned his own gaze bitterly forward. Je and Chea were young, but still they were years older than he was. They had had more experience, but he was How. His eyes and ears were sharper than theirs. He could see that there was no flaw in this circle. More, he could see that this circle contained twice as many people as it should have needed to make it secure, and that those people were a well-disciplined force. The foreign fighters had spaced themselves evenly and now moved together in spite of their numbers. They did not get in each other's way, as they would have had they been less well-trained. They'd left no holes big enough for an alert hunter or judge to go through. There was no way out for Je and Chea. But Dayut saw that he alone, using the greater strength and speed that was part of his How heritage, and perhaps breaking a neck or two, might be able to get free. He thought about it. Would his escape provide enough of a diversion to give Je and Chea their opening? It would if their captors were too startled to move in at once and kill them, but that seemed unlikely. The fighters of the circle were moving along easily with Dayut's party now, subtly guiding it but never closing in or being obvious. This was a form of courtesy extended to captives whose status had not yet been decided, captives who had not yet been judged dangerous. Perhaps the desert people considered Dayut's party too small to be actively hostile, but if Dayut broke through their circle, killed one or two of their fighters, they would change their minds quickly. and they would do their best to make Je and Chea pay for the deaths Dayut had caused. They looked far too efficient to lose all 3 of their captives. Dayut decided to wait. The desert people were obeying the conventions meticulously, when, with their superior numbers, they certainly did not have to. He would suspend judgment on them as they apparently had on him. He kept his party moving as slowly as it had before he became aware of his captors. The desert people did not hurry him, did not prod him at all, as long as he continued to follow the river. If he strayed, however, and he did, testing, the fighters toward whom he strayed ceased to move, became more visible, quietly threatening. He allowed himself to be intimidated and spent the rest of the long night going where they wanted him to go. He had ceased to think about the ruins that he had come so far to see. He was not watching for them at all, but he was not surprised when, early during the second night of his captivity, he found himself approaching them. He had already decided that his captors must be heading toward them, that their people must have moved into the desert ruin as, generations before, Dayut's people had moved into an ancient mountain ruin. The desert people had made their city's main entrances too visible, Dayut thought, as he looked down the hillside at them. The ruin itself began on the hillside, or rather within the hill, just above where the river cut through the last of the hills to flow across flatter lands toward the sea. It seemed to Dayut that the desert tribe had cut away too much of the vegetation over and around their dwelling and planted their crops too openly at the base of the hill in the wide spread of soil that the river had deposited. But perhaps desert customs were different. Perhaps this vast treeless land made the kind of camouflage that Dayut was used to too difficult. Or perhaps these desert people had simply not had a war, as Dayut's people had, to make them cautious. As Dayut and his party started down the hill, their escort became visible. Other people were also visible around the ill-concealed entrances. Several non-fighters, farmers and artisans, stood in scattered bunches watching Dayut in particular. The non-fighters were shy, quiet green or yellow-green people who would not have been out if they had expected trouble. Dayut noted, though, that there were no children visible. The desert people were not that certain of his party's docility then. Dayut brought to mind the model of this dwelling that existed in vast detail back at his mountain home. Long ago, a highly skilled imperial artisan had been traded from his home in the desert city to the mountain city that Dayut's people now occupied. Non-fighters had been more harshly treated in those days, and fighters commonly regarded them as property, trade goods. But this artisan had apparently loved his city too much to face the prospect of never seeing it again. Thus he had built a model of it, the desert city in miniature. It filled an entire room and was nothing to be carried about, but Dayut had used it to memorize the floor plan of the desert dwelling. Now he used that memory to decide which of the entrances to approach. No one stopped him or spoke to him. He was pleased to see that some of the desert people did look surprised, however. His body glowed luminescent blue. Let them wonder how he knew which public entrance led most directly to the apartment of their How, or of their chief judge if they were unlucky enough to be without a How. Dayut stopped in front of that entrance, feeling tense with anticipation in spite of himself. He had not seen another of his own kind since war took the lives of his mother and his uncle, and the training, the discipline that these people had shown bespoke the presence of a How. Finally, the desert How came out. She was a woman of middle years, her coloring still deep blue, not yet touched with the flecks of yellow that foretold advanced age. Her body was straight and lean, and she was the first person Dayut had seen since he had attained his full growth who could match him in height. Her coloring attracted him, held his attention as though he had never seen another How. He realized that he had, on seeing her, automatically dimmed his own brilliance and let his coloring return to normal. To continue his blinding luminescence now that she was present seemed challenging somehow, and Dayut could think of nothing he wanted from this desert town to warrant his challenging an older, more experienced How. He and the woman gazed at each other for a long moment, without speaking, each appraising the other. Was she as hungry for the sight of another of her kind as he had been? Dayut wondered. She spoke finally. "You're welcome here, cousin, you and those with you. I am Tahne." She looked past him at her people, who had gathered around at a respectful distance. "We are Rohan." Thus, for the first time, Dayut learned the name of his host captors. Tahne had a dry, somehow ironic voice that made Dayut wonder if she found him and his party amusing. There was no white in her coloring, but still he felt that her manner was slightly mocking. She spoke in the old imperial language, the language of conversing with strangers and of writing. And in the old language she had the right to call him cousin, since according to tradition all How were related. They could come out of the air, born inexplicably to families of judges, or they could descend from long lines of their own kind. But the blue related them regardless. It deified them and made them members of the How family, the highest and best fighters that the people could produce. Dayut answered in his own flawless imperial. "I am Dayut. My companions are Je and Chea." He gestured toward each one of them in turn. "We are Tekhon." The woman glanced toward the distant wall of mountains. "Tekhon? Mountain people." She translated the word into her own tribe's dialect with a change of stress that made it almost unrecognizable. Then, in the old language again, "You're a long way from home, Tekhon How." Dayut found himself impressed with her use of his title. Since his acknowledgment, his own people had begun addressing him by title instead of by name, of course, but somehow it meant more coming from another How. He answered Tahne's implied question without resentment. "We trace the ways of our ancestors. Our map told us there were ruins here. We didn't know that the Rohan had occupied them." As he spoke, the woman watched him in a way that made him glad he had no reason to lie to her. "You have one of the old maps with you, then?" she asked. He reached back to the pouch strapped across his shoulders, found the map by touch, and handed it to her. She unrolled it and looked at it, felt the smooth, tough, clear coating that covered the fine paper and made it flexible but nearly indestructible. The art of making such permanent records had been lost to most of the Khon tribes since the splintering of the empire, because the main ingredient for the coating came from trees far down the wild eastern slopes of the mountains. The map seemed to impress Tahne. She handed it back, and with a slight, now proper whitening of her coloring to emphasize the positive spirit in which she spoke, she said, "Eat with us, Tekhon How, and rest. When you're ready, I'll show you the ruins myself. We Rohan occupy only a small part of them." Tahne saw to it that the young mountain How was treated as an honored guest. She had a special meal prepared for him, a meal that would permit him to sample the fish and bird delicacies of the coast, but that would also let him return, if he chose, to the more familiar meats that her hunters brought back from the game traps of the foothills. She kept the affair small, however, inviting only the chiefs of each of her 4 castes and their mates. The drought had not left enough food for real feasting. She had the meal served in the main chamber of her own apartment, and before it was served, she found time to speak privately with Ehre. "I want no special watch kept on Dayut," she told him. "Do nothing to frighten him or make him suspicious, and we'll have no trouble with him. I'll see that no one bothers him," Ehre promised. "He'll be safe as long as he's with you, anyway." Tahne looked at him sharply. He was too quick. Another time, his speed in understanding her would have been amusing. Another time, but not now. His eyes seemed to hold no expression at all as he spoke again. "Later, Tahne, when you give him to us, He'll see you as his betrayer. So? His words angered her, and her tone was bitter. And to avoid that, you would rather I give him to you now. I would, but I know you won't. In your place, I probably wouldn't either. Ehre sighed. He would hate you anyway, because you symbolize us. But he's young. Perhaps he'll get over his hatred. Tahne looked past him at a dimly glowing patch of wall. She could speak more freely to Ehre than she could to others. She could talk to him as much as she could talk to anyone. I surprised myself, she said softly. I looked at Dayut, and I decided that I had been alone long enough, that I would have him tonight while he was still whole and free. I gave no consideration at all to what he might feel later. I didn't care. And now you do care, said Ehre, but not enough to stop. She refocused her eyes to look at him. No, not enough to stop. I tell myself that I'm giving him a few more hours of freedom. You are. She flashed yellow denial, disgust. He laid a hand on her shoulder with the familiarity of a close friend. You yourself feel that you're betraying him. I didn't realize that. You're not, of course. She said nothing. This is the succession, Tahne. His voice became hard. You have responsibilities, but for once you have no rights. You're duty-bound to help us, or at least not to interfere with us. You didn't catch him for us, and you can't release him, so how can you be his betrayer? She took his hand from her shoulder, held it for a moment, then let it go. Not all feelings are reasonable, Ehre. It doesn't matter. It will matter. If you go to him feeling as you do now, you'll have the bones of a liaison. He's how, and yet your guilt could cause you to find less with him than you could with some hunter. Ehre's blue-green body glowed with the intensity of his feeling. Make yourself two people, Tahne. You know how. You need not to be tonight the person that you must become tomorrow. Later, as she ate, surrounded by the best of her fighter and non-fighter castes with Dayut beside her, she struggled to follow Ehre's advice. She knew he was right, and it would not be the first time that she had had to split herself in two. She was no stranger to unpleasant duties. It was just that none of them had ever touched her so deeply before. None of them had ever concerned another How. The two companions of the Tekon How provided her with an unexpected diversion when they mentioned that they were married. Intercaste marriages were so rare among the Rohan that Tahne would have had to go to the tribal records to find out when the last one had taken place. She looked at the huntress and the judge with more interest now and saw, by their coloring, that both were high in their respective castes. Jeh was a deep, quiet blue-green, no more than a shade or two yellower than Ehre. It was possible that if the young judge lived up to the promise of his coloring, he could become a chief himself some day. And Chea, his wife. Although she was unusually small for a huntress, she was almost exactly the same dark green as Tahne's chief hunter. It was possible that Dayut had plans for them both. Tahne refused to think further in that direction. She questioned Chea curiously. Didn't you have trouble in your liaison? Weren't there challengers? People who joined in intercaste liaisons were nearly always challenged by members of their own caste. Members who chose to be insulted that one of their own had turned away from them. Chea whitened, remembering. I had 3 challengers, Rohan How. Only 3. The number was unusually small, probably due to Chea's high coloring. The little huntress was boasting. It was not necessary for her to say what had happened to her challengers. She was still alive, therefore they must be dead. She looked at her husband. I had 5 challengers, said Jeh. He showed no white in his coloring, but in his eyes there was a look of cold satisfaction. You would have had more here, Ehre said quietly from his place at Tahne's left. Ehre's prejudice against hunters and against hunter-judge intermarriage was at least one of the reasons why there had been no such intermarriage in recent Rokan history. Jeh let his dark eyes travel over the chief judge silently, almost insolently, measuring. "I think not," he said softly. "I would have had more at home, but I made certain that many people saw each of the 5. By the end of the 5th, all disapproval had vanished." His coloring had brightened with his intensity, and his tone had been one of confident challenge. Tahne was surprised at how easily the situation amused her. "Peace, young one," she said quickly. They were still savage young animals, these two, but then that was why they were still alive. "Your people accept your union now? Some said first that we were a bad example to the children," said Chea. "But by the time our son was born to make our liaison a marriage, most had accepted us." Tahne turned to look at Dayut, who had ignored the conversation around him and concentrated silently on his food. "Tekon Hao, what did you think of your friend's marriage?" "I was too young for my thoughts on the subject to matter," he said. He shifted uncomfortably. "I hadn't yet been acknowledged." He was acknowledged now, then. That answered one question no one had gotten around to asking him. He continued eating as though he expected his answer to satisfy her. "What the How thinks is always important," she said. "I don't believe they would have dared anything as lengthy as a marriage if you had objected to it." "No, I didn't object, Rokan Hao." He did not look at her. He seemed ill at ease, she thought, as though the gathering that she had arranged to honor him had only made him nervous. But no, that wasn't likely. He would be used to dealing with people of high rank. It wasn't the presence of her chiefs that was bothering him, it was her own presence. Deliberately, Tahne continued to look at him as though she expected him to say more, as though she might even disapprove of his liberal attitude. He became defensive. There was no reason for them not to marry, not after they had defeated their challengers. "So," Tahne said noncommittally. She looked away from him and took a bite of fish. She could almost feel his relief. She could not have been around Hao before, she decided. Of course, neither had she for some time, but she had at least had her father to guide her while she was growing up. Dayut acted as though he had had no Hao example at all to follow. Also, there was the matter of his youth. Tahne could remember what it was like to be a newly acknowledged, uncertain young Hao, afraid of a misstep, afraid of shaming oneself, afraid even of the Hao responsibilities. It occurred to her that such fears might have been the reason for his leaving home. Others had begun carrying on their own quiet conversations when she spoke to him again. "You were acknowledged just before you left home, Tekon Hao?" He glanced at her. "Yes," he said quietly. Tahne whitened, in spite of herself. "And when you insisted on traveling away from home, your council of judges and your chiefs became angry enough to take back their acknowledgment if they could have." Dayut's coloring became faintly blue-green as it took on a small amount of yellow. Then he caught himself, restored his normal blue, and looked at her angrily. She realized that he had misread her. He thought she was trying to humiliate him. She deliberately kept amusement in her voice and coloring as she continued. "After my acknowledgment, I explored the ruins here myself. I found a place where one of our passageways connected with a network of natural caverns, and I followed the caverns through the northern hills until I emerged on a cliff overlooking the sea. I was gone for days. My people were frantic." The memory was surprisingly pleasant. She had all but forgotten it, her own assertion of independence. She glanced at him and found him watching her. He turned away a little too quickly and picked up a piece of fruit, but at least he had lost his anger. He was far too sensitive, she thought. But how, especially how raised by judges, were never treated as roughly as they should be. They were too valuable, and as they grew past puberty, too dangerous. She continued to watch him, enjoying beauty that he probably did not realize he possessed. That was another attribute of the How, although Tahne did not see that she herself possessed it to any unusual degree. He was well-muscled and deep-chested in the way of mountain people. His eyes were mountain narrow, and his face was angular and lean, with none of the roundness of her own. This would have made him seem older, grimmer, had he not been so obviously unable to cope with another How on equal terms. His age made no difference now, though. Only his blue was important. The color drew Tahne's eyes as her blue had always drawn the eyes of her people. And now that he understood that her mocking had not been malicious, she could see that her blue was affecting him too. He could not help turning now and then to look at her. She chose one of these stolen glances to meet his eyes with a look of quiet invitation. In his eyes, then, just for a moment, she saw hunger as intense as her own. She made herself look away and continue eating, but the food was abruptly tasteless. She waited impatiently until the meal was over. Only then, after her people had gone home and his friends had been taken to the nearby guest apartment, did she permit her body to express the joy she felt in blinding luminescence. He was more hesitant. Perhaps he found her overwhelming. Not that it mattered. She drew his hard, flat young body to her and immediately gave the caress that directly preceded coupling. She lowered her head and gently bit the tender flesh of his throat. Her suddenness seemed both to startle and to excite him, as she had intended. As she pulled him down to the pallet of furs before her fireplace, the uncertain iridescence of his coloring resolved itself and became, like her own, a blinding blue-white. Later, it was as though they had been liaison mates for a full season. They lay content, close together, without the tension that had earlier separated them, and Tahne asked the questions that had drawn her curiosity. Was Dayut alone among his people? A How born of judge parents? "I'm alone now," he told her quietly. "But my parents were both How, and I had a How uncle. My people have always produced an abundance of the blue. They must also lose it in abundance if only you were left." "So," he agreed, "we had a war. My father was captured and given poison. He died writhing in the dust instead of honorably in combat. That was before I was even old enough to know him. My mother and uncle fought to avenge him, but finally they were killed too." "Who were your enemies?" "Garkhan, people who live in one of the mountain valleys." The name meant nothing to Tahne. "You grew up with no How teacher, then?" He moved slightly beside her. "I did, although it didn't mean much to me until I was nearly ready to be acknowledged. Then I realized that on the day of my acknowledgement I would have a problem that my upbringing had not prepared me to handle." He looked at her to make sure that she was listening. Seeing that she was, he went on. "In the war, my people hurt the Garkhan, but not decisively. Their How was injured, but not killed, and though they lost more fighters than we did, they had many more to begin with. Their losses didn't begin to bring them even with us. My people were afraid to continue fighting, with no How to lead them. They agreed to a humiliating peace with the Garkhan and ignored most of the raids that the Garkhan made in violation of that peace. They would have accepted a tie with the Garkhan and become Garkhan themselves if there had not been so much hatred on both sides." He stopped, and Tahne looked at him questioningly. "The Garkhan are still raiding?" "So? And now that you're acknowledged, your people want you to renew the war against them." His body flared yellow. They want it. Yes, they expect it. And you don't want it. He let his coloring darken back to a cold, metallic blue. I want to stop the raiding. I will stop it. But to begin the war again would be utter foolishness. Even if we could win, it wouldn't gain us anything. We don't want the Garkon Valley or their people, not even their children. He made a sound of disgust. But that's meaningless. We couldn't win. I'm not even sure we could survive this time. The Garkon still outnumber us vastly, and they seem to be making none of the mistakes that they so obligingly made for my family. He paused for a moment. But in spite of all that, cousin, do you know why my otherwise sensible people still believe we should fight? I can guess, Tahne said softly. The Garkon, they've lost their how? Dayut yellowed once more, spoke harshly. That is our whole advantage. I am our whole advantage. The Garkon how died while I was growing up. Perhaps the injuries my people gave him helped him along. I don't know. Anyway, he left no successor. That alone is supposed to weaken the Garkon enough for us to defeat them. Dayut, that's no small thing. It may very well weaken them enough. So, said Dayut bitterly, for the lack of only one fighter, they become vulnerable to a tribe half their size, a tribe led by a How whose only knowledge of war has come from reading and listening to others. My chief judge is more fit to lead in such a war than I am. But he didn't. He waited and gave the problem to you, because he's only a judge, and you're How. Dayut turned away from her abruptly, as though in disgust. That's not enough. Tahne said nothing, only placed a hand on his shoulder until he turned back. It's not enough, he repeated. I have the coloring, yes, but judges raised me, trained me. Cousin, I'm nothing more now than a judge colored blue, and perhaps not even such a good judge, since my coloring made my guardians indulge me more than they should have. So, Tahne said quietly, I wondered if you knew that about yourself. He grayed bleakly. She sat up and looked down at him. You're not ready to fight, she said. Therefore, letting your people push you into war would be foolish, as you say. You're acknowledged now. You can make an unpopular decision. You can say, no, we won't fight yet. I'll look at the situation, and when I've examined it thoroughly, I'll decide whether or not we'll fight at all. He watched her very closely. Even though they've planned their vengeance for so long, depended on it, lived for it, even so, you are their How. Give them new goals. Teach them that they are a new people now that they've acknowledged your authority. Tahne held up one hand before her, fingers stiffly together. There is only one thing that the How does not control, and that is the succession. You should expect your people to accept your judgment on any other matter. It's a decision that I would have to take before my council of judges. They've been like parents to me since my mother and uncle were killed. Perhaps, but once you're acknowledged, you're the parent. She had been wondering about the way he was watching her, and now, finally, she understood it. She whitened slightly. I'm only saying things to you that you've already said to yourself. He hesitated, then letting his own coloring whiten. So, well, do you feel better now that I've said them too? I do. Yes. He touched her throat. When I said them to myself, I felt like a child playing at being a ruler. I was even afraid at first that my council would treat me like a child and ignore me. He flashed yellow. Sometimes I'm still afraid. You'll lose the fear. He seemed to accept this and said, I've never spoken this way to another person, especially I've never admitted to anyone else that I had doubts about the high value placed on the blue. She stroked his shoulder. Your How relatives gave you something then. These are things that should never be said to any but another How. He caught her arm and pulled her down beside him. And you, cousin? Are there things you need to say? Only... She closed her eyes for a moment and put her forehead against his shoulder. Only that I wish there were more of us. He could not know the desolation behind her words. He could not know that for a moment her deliberately established dichotomy had slipped, and she had been unable to continue to face him. He gave her no words of comfort, but he held her, stroking her, caressing her almost in the way of a parent comforting a child. At first she tried to pull away, ashamed. "Be still," he told her softly. She paused, looking into his dimly glowing blue coloring. Then she lay still and let his hands first relax, then arouse her. Finally, she reached over, clasped his throat between thumb and fingers, and felt the steady, even pulse of life there. He caught her hand and held it where it was, as he leaned over and bit her gently near the base of her throat. As they coupled, she found herself thinking for a moment of the ancient meaning of the bite and the hand-to-throat gestures. I hold your life, and do not take it. They had begun as gestures of trust rather than of affection, but their meaning had grown. Now, depending on the circumstances, a simple lifting of the head, as she had lifted hers to receive his bite, could mean trust, affection, challenge, or contempt. It was, Tahne thought bitterly, the perfect gesture for a betrayal. Dayut woke slowly, a luxury he had not permitted himself since leaving home, and knew at once that Tahne was not beside him. That was why he had awakened. The sound of her breathing, which had become part of the room for him, had ceased just a moment before as she had left the apartment. He was not alarmed. It was his own custom to rise early, go out, and bathe in the river and ran below the cliff homes of his people. Tahne's river, a narrow, muddy stream, would not offer much in the way of bathing, but she might be attending to some other morning ritual, or she might have some tribal business to take care of. Dayut rose, deciding to go outside where he could wander freely and watch the town come to life. He stood still for a moment, remembering the night and savoring the memory. He had had many liaisons already among his people, but Tahne had been a different experience. Her aggressiveness had not only surprised him, but had angered him until he realized that she had the right. Who led in a liaison in almost any activity was determined by whose coloring had more blue. Fighter castes in particular could spot minute differences, but both Dayut and Tahne were completely blue. How blue? Among the How there were no degrees of coloration. This did not mean that all How were equal, but simply that two How who wished to know which one was superior would have to fight to find out. As long as Dayut and Tahne had not fought, Tahne had as much right to lead as Dayut did. But there would be no fighting. Dayut felt certain of that. He had accepted the woman too completely, accepted her without reservations, as he had never done with any other person. He had spoken his heresies openly for her judgment. All this because Tahne was blue. Perhaps there was something to the mysticism surrounding the blue. If it could move him so strongly, how much more must it sway others who were not blue themselves? Dayut glanced at one wall, knowing the location of the door from memory, rather than from any obvious crack or other sign of its presence. The interior camouflage of the Rohan dwelling was the best that he had ever seen. It was as subtle as the exterior was obvious, and it challenged him. He wondered if he could have found Tahne's door in the dim general passageway, or whether he could have even found his way out of the apartment had he not memorized the position of the door. From the floor plan that he remembered, he knew there was another exit, two more, in fact. but one was an emergency exit, probably carefully set with traps for pursuers who did not know how to avoid them. This was an exit to be used in war, when all else had already failed. Dayut did not even try to find it. In fact, since he knew its general vicinity, he kept away from that part of the apartment. He went instead to the area of the other, safer exit. This was a room filled with Tahne's maps and records. The maps in particular attracted him, but he ignored them for the moment, studying the walls for some sign of the door he sought. When he had been around the room once, looking and failing to see, he stopped. He stood in the center of the room and asked himself where he would put a door if he was an artisan building the best possible concealed exit for his how. He found it then, partially covered with shelving and dropped slightly so that the first step out of it was a step down. That step was followed by a long, steep stairway up, since this exit, unlike the main one, was available only to Tahne. There was no passageway, and the steps led directly to the surface. Dayut came up near the river. He had just enough time to notice that fact, to look down at the thin stream flowing sluggishly around large stones. Then, as his captors dropped their camouflage, Dayut realized that he was, for a second time, surrounded by Rohan fighters. The day before, when he had to be considered potentially hostile, the heavy guard that the Rohan had kept on him had been reasonable. Today, however, after he had spent a night in the arms of the Rohan How, such obvious heavy-handed methods were not only offensive, they were threatening. He knew that he had given Tahne no reason to suspect him of being anything other than he actually was. Therefore, Tahne must have her own reasons for causing her people to threaten him. But the fighters who encircled him this time formed only a small single ring, and they were mostly hunters. They were not nearly enough to hold him. The instant the Rohan appeared, Dayut spotted their yellowest hunter, the one he would have the least difficulty going past, or over. He had whirled to face that hunter when someone called out from the hill above. "Stop! Take on now! We have your friends!" Shouting alone would not have diverted Dayut's attention, but the content of this particular shout made him look up, just as it was intended to. Atop the slight rise that was the roof of Tahne's apartment stood Ehre, the Rohan chief judge. Beside Ehre, tied to upright stakes, were Je and Chea. Dayut saw all this and understood it in the instant before a tiny sound alerted him to the closing of the circle. His coloring flared luminescent, a blue brilliant enough to hurt the eyes, and for an instant even the hardened, prepared fighters could not help responding, hesitating, to attack the blue. Only the two judges of the circle managed to recover themselves quickly enough to try to stop Dayut as he fled back to the door of Tahne's apartment. Out of the corner of his eye he had seen what appeared to be every fighter the Rohan town could muster, fanning out thickly, closing toward him from the direction of the main entrances, where they had either been waiting for him or been about to go in and get him. Real fear touched him at last. He could be certain now of what the Rohan had in mind. He was to be stood before the tall, lean Ehre and asked a question. This after he was captured and helpless, and on his answer would depend his own future and the lives of Je and Chea. Either the judge and huntress would be set free to return to the Tehon to say that Dayut had renounced them, his own people, or Je and Chea must be killed to prevent them from returning to the Tehon with word that the Rohan had stolen and crippled the Tehon How. Dayut knew all this in a single instant of realization. He had no time to think. He could only react and retreat. The two judges came at him from opposite directions. The one on his right reached him first and struck out savagely, as though expecting to knock him unconscious at once. Dayut blocked the blows and, in a continuing motion, jabbed hard into the man's larynx. The judge fell, his coloring the involuntary sun yellow of pain and death. Dayut whirled instantly, raising his left arm to block another blow that he had sensed more than seen from the other judge. But the other had been too close. Dayut was not quite fast enough. His arm took the full impact of a blow meant for his neck. The arm went numb and for vital instants hung useless at his side. Without pausing, he drove his right fist hard into the solar plexus of his new opponent, striking upward toward the heart. As the judge fell, Dayut leaped back, taking the last step toward Tahne's door. A hunter leaped high at Dayut, his body a green sun of luminescence. At the last instant, he seemed to twist in midair so that he landed just out of Dayut's reach. Dayut ignored him, pressing back hard against the door, flattening himself into it just in time to avoid the rear attack of a huntress with more serious intentions and less obvious ways. The whole circle was shrinking, closing in on him. Dayut moved his hand quickly over the door behind him until he found the hand grip. Abruptly, he threw the door open into the face of yet another attacking hunter and dove through. He ran down the stairs to Tahne's apartment, knowing that he might be running into worse trouble. He had done a single unexpected thing, come through an exit that the Rokhan had not expected him to know about, and that they had given only cursory coverage. That was why he was still alive, for he would surely force them to kill him rather than submit to the agony of crippling, the humiliation of captivity. The apartment was still empty. He fled through it into what he hoped was an equally empty passageway. The passageway contained only 3 non-fighters hurrying toward the exit, probably to watch the capture. When they found themselves facing the Tekon Hao, uncaptured, desperate, they leaped terrified out of his path and faded instantly into the rough walls. Dayut ignored them, ran on silently down the passageway. It occurred to him a moment later that one of the things he could do to make the Rokhan angry enough to kill him, rather than capture him, would be to kill a few non-fighters. The thought repelled him, however, and he knew he would not do such a thing if he had had any other choice. Like all Khan, he had spent his early years mostly in the care of non-fighters. He felt a strong emotional bond with the gentle, defenseless people. Besides that, he was no longer thinking of dying. His memory of the floor plan of this ancient dwelling might very well give him life. Apart from the 3 non-fighters, the passageway ahead seemed deserted. Faint sounds behind him told him he was pursued by a large number of people, and he realized from his own knowledge that other Rokhan must be moving above ground, either to block the exits or to come through them and cut him off. His only hope seemed to lie in running, dodging, hiding, fighting, until he could find the unused portions of the dwelling where there were passageways and exits that the Rokhan might not be able to cover. Dayut followed the main passageway for several minutes, knowing that it was the most dangerous way for him, but fearful of leaving it because it was also the most certain way. In his mind, he carried the full floor plan of the city as he had been at the height of the empire, but his own people lived in imperial ruins, and he knew that they had made changes that would have made an imperial floor plan of their dwelling dangerously inaccurate in spots. From what he had seen of the Rokhan, the tribe was smaller than his own, but still large enough to make changes in the part of the desert dwelling that they occupied. An animal snarl and a cry of pain just around a bend in the passageway stopped Dayut's headlong run. He did not need to see what was ahead to know that he had now reached the heart of the dwelling. Here lived the non-fighters and the young children, surrounded by a protective ring of fighters' apartments. Dayut was surprised that he had been allowed to reach so easily what should have been a jealously guarded area. But he had been fortunate enough to catch his pursuers unaware, and, too, the defense arrangement was not expected to keep out a Hao. especially not a How who knew how to avoid the false turns. Daiut stood still for a moment and listened to the squalling ahead of him. He could no longer hear his pursuers, though he had no doubt that he would be hearing them again soon. There should be a fork in the tunnel just ahead. One passageway was only part of the inner ring that connected the non-fighter apartments. The second passageway, however, should lead to a second double ring of fighter and non-fighter apartments, and to a third, a fourth, and a fifth. The ancient ruin had grown by duplicating itself, becoming a city of 5 parts, but Daiut doubted that the small tribe of Rokan occupied even all of the one double ring that they had taken over. If he could get to one of the unoccupied rings and find his way out... He hesitated, knowing that the second passageway went once more through the outer ring of this circle and, doubtless, through a line of Rokan fighters who would be more adequately prepared this time. But it was his only real chance. He flattened himself against the wall, blending instantly and invisibly into it, then reblending as he moved so that only someone who happened to be staring intently as he moved along would notice him. And by the sounds ahead, he doubted that anyone would be paying attention to the walls. He edged around the bend until he was able to see what he had expected: 2 deep green hunter children rolling on the floor, biting, kicking, punching, clawing each other savagely. A few other children of fighter and non-fighter castes stood in a circle around the combatants, watching silently. A pair of adult non-fighters came out of a nearby apartment and crossed the passageway to another apartment, hardly giving the hunter children a glance. Daiut watched the fighting children, seeing that both were tired and hurt. He knew that the fight would soon end. If it ended with him where he was, though, he might have to reveal himself to escape. No one in this section would try to stop him if he revealed himself, but the non-fighters would immediately send messengers to his pursuers. As things stood, the Rokan fighters behind him could not be certain whether he was still moving or whether he had camouflaged himself in the hope that his superior ability would prevent his being seen. Or he might have turned down a side passageway or found his way into another apartment. They could not run headlong as he had. They had to check all the possibilities as they followed. He had that much of an advantage, and he did not intend to give it away. As he continued to move, the topmost child of the fighting pair managed to get a hold on the throat of his opponent with his strong young teeth. The bottom child instantly turned the faded yellow of submission, and the fight was over. The winner stood up, his body luminescent green with victory. The loser took longer to get up. He maintained his submissive yellow and met the winner's eyes gravely when that child looked at him. But when the winner advanced on him once more, the watching fighter children, passive until then, abruptly formed a line separating the combatants and facing the winner. The bluest child in the line, a boy who would someday be a judge, spoke authoritatively. Daiut's familiarity with the situation and with the imperial root language permitted him to understand most of what was said and to fill in what he did not understand. "There is nothing more to decide, Cho. You are stronger and more blue," said the winner hotly. The young judge-to-be turned, looked questioningly at the loser. The loser seemed to meet his defender's gaze with difficulty, but he was proud. He did not break down. He did not turn his face away, but he did not say the necessary words either. The protective line of children melted away as quickly as it had formed, and Cho advanced again as though he had not been interrupted. The loser stood his ground, his desperation showing only in his eyes. He made no move to defend himself as Cho approached. Perhaps Cho was impressed by his courage, as he hesitated instead of striking at once. "What can you win?" Cho asked. "Are you ashamed to admit the truth?" The loser seemed to come to the necessary decision slowly. His eyes became less desperate, more resigned. When he first opened his mouth to speak, he had no voice and had to try again. The second time he succeeded. "I'm ashamed," he said. "You will be too some day." Then, very softly, "You're more blue." The excitement was over, and Dayut was not yet near the tunnel fork that he had been approaching. He stopped and waited, completely undetectable now that he was no longer moving. He knew that the passageway where it widened for the fork was probably a regular gathering place for the children, but now that the fight was over, perhaps they would leave. If they did not, if he let them keep him where he was long enough for his pursuers to reach this part of the dwelling, it would not be necessary for him to be visible to be found. The Rohan fighters would have torches by now for testing the walls. A single torch drawn along the wall until it reached him would burn him and caused a reflexive change in his coloring. Some of the children were leaving. The two who had fought and 3 others went away to various apartments along the passageway. The others, however, after discussing the fight until it became boring, organized one of the hiding games that served the double purpose of keeping them occupied and forcing them to improve their camouflage skills. To make matters worse, Dayut caught the sound of many feet moving slowly down the passageway that he had intended to enter. These were sounds that he had expected to hear from behind him, but apparently his enemies had seen their own weakness, their inability to cover the unoccupied parts of the dwelling, and they had anticipated him. A moment later he heard the Rohan behind him too, and knew that his concealment had become useless. Immediately he ceased his camouflage. 2 of the children, who happened to be facing in his direction when he became visible, flared yellow and fled. Others looked to see what had frightened them, then scattered to vanish inexpertly into the nearby walls. In full view of all of them, Dayut walked to the apartment that he had seen Cho enter. As that apartment door had opened, Dayut, directly across from it, had seen several non-fighters and younger children inside. It looked, Dayut thought bitterly, like a good place to make a last stand. The adults inside the apartment were artisans, specifically weavers. The apartment was only a single room containing several large rooms. It was clearly a factory rather than a living area. Apparently the Rohan made greater use of cloth than did Dayut's Tekon, who preferred animal skins almost exclusively for their mats and blankets. Within the room, some children sat on the floor and played a game with small, sticky, and smooth stones, while others clustered around the sides of one of the looms, listening to a male artisan who was telling them a story. One child, Dayut saw at once that it was Cho, stood alone beside the loom of a quietly beautiful artisan female, no doubt telling her of his recent victory. The woman was probably one of his guardians. Dayut's size and coloring attracted everyone's attention at once. Weavers ceased their monotonous work, and the children on the floor stopped their game. But this time, in the closed room, no one tried to run. The children waited to see what the adults would do, and the adults were apparently not willing to abandon the children as they would have to do if they hoped to escape. After a moment of silence, Cho's foster mother, who happened, with her bright yellow-green coloring, to be the bluest adult present, stood up and faced Dayut. "You are the Tekon How?" She spoke the imperial language flawlessly, in spite of fear that she did not even try to hide. "So," answered Dayut. She looked around the room at the children and other non-fighters, then looked back to Dayut. "There is another way out of this room, Tekon How?" "I'm aware of it," Dayut said regretfully. The camouflage here was not as good as in Tahne's apartment, and he had just spotted it, but he had noticed something else, too. "It leads to a passageway now being searched." At this depth, no single apartment had a passageway that led directly to the surface. The woman spoke more softly. If there must be fighting here, then, will you let the youngest children be taken out?" "No," Dayut said. The woman accepted this as though she had expected it. Her eyes half closed as though in pain. She said, "We're at your command, Tekhon Hao." Dayut sighed. "Get the children off the floor. Keep them well back against the looms with you, and they may not be hurt." While other weavers moved to get the young children, the woman continued to face Dayut. "We will keep them behind us," she said quietly. Dayut accepted this in silence. Cho's hunter parents had placed him well. For a non-fighter, the woman had rare courage. There was a wait that probably seemed longer than it was for the two search parties to come together outside the door of the weaver's room. Soon, Dayut knew, he would have every fighter in the dwelling outside that door. But within the room, he had 12 non-fighter adults and 15 children. That fact alone might keep the Rohan outside for quite a while. It took time to decide to sacrifice non-fighters and children, and there was no doubt that the searchers understood the implied threat of Dayut's fleeing into a room full of defenseless people. Dayut had only the ignorance of the Rohan in his favor now. They did not know whether the Mountain How was savage enough to begin slaughtering his prisoners if he were attacked. They did not know whether the first fighter through the door would be met by the hurled body of a dead child. Or most of them did not know. One of them, however, despite their short acquaintance, probably knew Dayut dangerously well. The door opened silently, slowly, and the Rohan How stepped through it with no attempt at camouflage. Tahne understood the situation at a glance, that glance being all the looking around she allowed herself in the presence of a desperate How. Dayut had harmed no one, had permitted the non-fighters to shield the children. The sight comforted her somehow, reassured her that she was not alone in her dangerous, foolish sentimentality. The fact that he had taken hostages in his position showed that he had decided to die. The only thing hostages could buy him was death, but in order to buy him even that, some of them had to die. She should have found some of them dead when she came in. Her coming, slow as it had been, should have triggered a few deaths. A corpse should have been flung at her as she entered. Dayut should have done everything he could to make her and her fighters believe they needed vengeance more than they needed a successor How. But Dayut had not been brutal enough, and now it was too late. She kept her eyes on him, but spoke to her non-fighters. "Take the children and leave quickly." The non-fighters obeyed immediately, Cho's foster mother leading the way. Dayut moved as though to a group that was warily passing him. When he moved, Tahne danced several quick steps toward him. He turned back to her, barely in time to stop her rush. She let him back away, now that he understood how well she would use his slightest inattention. He made no further effort to stop the non-fighters. They filed out slowly, and when they were gone, Ehrez's voice came through the doorway behind her. "They're all safe. Rohan How." "Close the door," Tahne ordered. There was a period of silence during which Tahne saw that she had surprised Dayut and guessed that she had surprised Ehrez as well. She had come to take part in the capture on hearing that Dayut held non-fighters and children hostage. Her only thought then had been to free the hostages safely. The Tekhon How concerned her deeply, and what was about to happen to him sickened her. But her own people came first. She could not have stood by and watched them destroyed by a foreigner, even though that foreigner was blue. Now that the hostages were safe, however, she found herself emotionally and physically unable to stand aside and permit her fighters to take Dayut. She knew that she was only putting off the inevitable. Dayut had to be taken. She could give him only minutes, but at least she could see that he got those. Ehrez spoke very carefully. "We are ready for him, Rohan How. He cannot escape us again." "So," agreed Tahne. She stepped aside, away from the doorway so that Ehre was not directly behind her. She saw Dayut grow tense and knew he thought she was giving him to her fighters. But out of the corner of her eye, she also saw Ehre become tense. The chief judge knew her far better than did Dayut. He could read her tone of voice even when her coloring remained neutral. He could understand when it was best to be silent and obey. Tahne spoke again very softly. "Close the door, Ehre." Without another word, Ehre stepped back out of the apartment and closed the door. When he was gone, Tahne gave her full attention to Dayut. He had lifted his head slightly, much as he had lifted it the night before, but this time the gesture was open challenge. Tahne ignored the challenge, sadly quoted her own words of the night before. "There is only one thing that the How does not control, and that is the succession." She grayed with helpless regret. "I don't want this, little cousin." "Don't you?" "I'm comforted, Tahne." He spat the words at her. "Your own people will commit this same act when you don't return to them," she said. "No tribe would deliberately remain without a How, and I can't give my people the successor that they must have. But they have you now. Later your judges might produce a How from the air. How often do such things happen, Dayut?" "They happen. They are considered miraculous. Do you think my people would let you go and gamble their future on a hoped-for miracle?" He did not answer. He turned his face away from her in a way that was calculated to be insulting. Again, she ignored the insult. She spoke gently. "You're the miracle, cousin, coming to us in this time of trouble when the people have finally admitted to themselves that I can't give them a successor, when our river is drying up, dying, and what can I do about your river?" He broke in angrily. "Do you think that by burning my legs and keeping me here you'll cause the river to fill again? The people believe that the blue will save them," she said simply, but she found herself again searching for some way to save him. She had already admitted that what had to be, that there was nothing she could do. Now, though, facing him, she could no longer accept that decision. She let her attention stray from him as she thought, and with no warning at all, he sprang at her. She managed to dodge backward at the last possible instant, and immediately she was all fighter again, watching, ready. Already she knew that he was not as fast as he should have been. She had been completely unprepared. She should not have had time to dodge. "What purpose can this serve?" she asked him. "Even if you kill me, you can't escape my people." "Revenge, perhaps." He faced her, his body seemingly relaxed. "If your people have their way, a lust for revenge is all I'll have left." "It hasn't happened yet," she said, almost angrily. She rubbed her forehead. "Dayut, if we're superior people at all, we should be able to find a way to stop it from happening." She had the beginnings of an idea. Radical, but perhaps workable. She needed time to think, though, and time to talk to him, but he was no longer in a mood to talk or to listen. Abruptly, he sprang forward again, aiming a jab at her throat that could have been lethal. She blocked the blow and moved quickly away from him without retaliating. He had to give up. He was ready to kill. He was ready to die. They stood apart, watching each other, and it occurred to her that Dayut fought as though he were fighting a judge or a hunter. No doubt it had been years since he had faced anyone who could match him in size, speed, and strength. Now he fought as though he expected his opponent to be physically inferior, as though he expected one blow to be enough. Of course, one blow from him could very easily be enough for a judge or a hunter, but the How were harder to kill. His shortcoming had made Tahne fairly sure that she could kill him, however. In fact, she was afraid he was going to make it difficult for her not to. But she knew that he would not listen to her until he had seen that he had no choice, that she was the better fighter. Grimly, she accepted his challenge. Tahne's coloring became the clearest of blues, luminescent, intense, the essence of all that was compelling and confusing about the How coloring. Dayut stared at her, feeling himself captured, drawn, momentarily as confused as any non-How might have been. He wanted to look away, to back away. He wanted to go to her, to touch her. With an effort, he threw off the influence. He wanted to kill her. He did nothing at all. He stood where he was, realizing that she could have struck him down while her coloring held him. Why hadn't she? Did she still think she could talk him into submission? Did she think she could use the bond of their mutual coloring to sway him? Deliberately, he let his own body flare into a harsher, less pleasing luminescence. In the midst of the flare, he shot toward her, striking again at her throat, hoping that his glare had blinded her. Tahne bent her body sharply to one side without moving her feet, so that his hand jabbed empty air, but her hand slashed stunningly into the side of his neck. He stumbled away, glaring at her in pain and rage. Blue or not, she was not far from the time when her coloring would begin to mottle with yellow age spots. She had no right to be so fast. He realized that she could have hit him a little differently and killed him if that had been her purpose, or she could have knocked him unconscious or crippled him. These last thoughts were chilling. Somehow he had to prevent her from crippling him or knocking him out and giving him to her people. Only by presenting a solid threat to her could he cause her to stop her training room defenses and fight to kill. He moved warily around her, watching her turn to keep him in view. "It's good to see that you've done something with your years," he said angrily. "Since you failed to produce a child for your people, you must have been left with much time to improve your fighting ability." "So," she agreed. And if the cruelty of the words touched her, she did not show it. She stood still now, relaxed, waiting. Then she stopped waiting. She advanced in quick, light steps, coming so suddenly that he was startled at first and backed away. She followed more slowly. He struck at her face. As she blocked, he kicked. But she danced away from him with the seeming ease of a judge outspeeding a hunter. For a brief instant, as she moved by him, she touched his throat lightly, much as she had touched it the night before. Then he had taken her touch as a gesture of affection. Now it could be only a sign of derision, contempt. It said, "See how easily I could kill you?" It said, "See what a poor fighter you are compared to me." It was all her speed, her flashing here and there to avoid him. He had not yet landed a real blow, and now this humiliation. He kicked again furiously, spurred by his shame. She leaped away, and he went after her. He hit her. His anger had given him speed. She was off balance. He hit her again, and she fell. Somehow she caught hold of him, half dragged him to the floor with her. He tore loose, went for her throat. She twisted away, pulled her legs up tight against her chest. She shot her feet forward with the force of her body's weight. But for once she was too slow. He dodged, came to his feet in the same motion. She started up, saw him, swiveled on one hip, kicking. She caught him once solidly in the shin, and he was thrown off balance. Instantly she was back on her feet facing him. "You could have put your foot on my throat just now," she said. He said nothing. They circled each other warily. "I could have killed you. You could have killed me." Still, he did not speak. Was it true? He wondered. Had he deliberately passed a chance to kill her? He knew without thinking any farther that he had, and his anger turned inward against himself. He hit her a glancing blow to the jaw, and she flashed yellow with pain and anger. She struck back, using her speed. Twice she hit him solid blows to the face. She kicked into the same shin that she had kicked before. He fell, his coloring blue-green as the yellow that he could not hold back announced his pain to her. His leg felt as though she had broken it. He had to move it to know that it was not broken. "Let this be the end of it, Dayut," she said sharply. "Hear what I have to say to you." She was too confident, standing too near him. Hardly thinking about what he did, he shot out a hand and seized one of her feet, jerking her off balance before she could kick. She fell, twisted, then was abruptly still as she felt his fingers at her throat. She waited, her eyes glittering into his. "Well, cousin?" He tightened his hold, willing her to make some defensive move. "We aren't children," he said harshly. "I challenged, you accepted. Then kill me, and become accustomed to that position." He was now kneeling over her. He gave her a long look of disgust, though he was more disgusted with himself. He knew he was not going to kill her. Worse, she knew it. He didn't understand how he could trust her again, give up his advantage when he knew what was in store for him. "What is your idea, Tahne?" he asked tiredly. He had no faith in her ideas, whatever they may be. She had said herself twice that the How did not control the succession. She had been right. She reached up with no special speed or strength and took his hands from her throat. She sat up and seemed to forget the fight. "We'll talk first," she said. She took a few deep breaths, then asked, "How many Tekon do you have at your dwelling?" "Almost 5,000. But why so many, in spite of your war?" "We were more. The Garkhan are over 10,000. She looked concerned. "How have you lived this long with such an imbalance?" "Our mountains are a wall against our enemies. The Garkhan raid our lower game traps, but they don't raid our dwelling." "So?" she said thoughtfully. "Then we're only 1,500. She darkened her blue fatalistically. "Desert tribes are small, and we're small even for a desert tribe. Perhaps now, though, that's for the best. Do you have room in your mountains for 1,500 more people, Tekon How?" By then, Dayut had seen it coming, but somehow it still shocked him. Her use of his title made her request formal and serious. "You'd consider moving your people so far from their traditional homeland?" "I won't consider it. I'll do it if you tell me they'll be welcome. The drought will drive us from here soon anyway." Dayut thought of his own people, tried to imagine their reaction if he told them he wanted them to move to the coastal desert. "Are you sure you can convince them?" She flared, luminescent. "You are even younger than I thought, cousin. My people will do what I tell them, exactly what I tell them." Dayut considered that, decided that it was probably true. His people obeyed him, even though they had just recently ceased to consider him a child, but he did not think they would leave their mountains for him. Would they be willing, then, to take in a whole tribe of foreigners simply because he ordered them to? He visualized himself before his council of judges giving the order, then drew back from the thought. He realized that his upbringing was hampering him again. In a childish way, he was still in awe of his council of judges. But Tahne was right. He did have to learn to expect, to demand obedience from them. It was true that they might disapprove of his decision out of habit. They had had things their way through the years of his childhood, but now they had acknowledged him, and he would have to teach them to obey. He spoke to Tahne. "There's room. Will your people return with me when I leave?" She whitened. "That would be best. There might be a part for your friends in this, too. But first I must know something more about them." Je and Chea? Guiltily, Dayut realized that he had hardly thought of his companions since he left them bound on the hill. Are they all right? He asked. Yes, they're under guard where you left them. Has their marriage made them pariahs among your people, Dayut? No. Most people accept them and respect them. The rest fear them and leave them alone. And they still rank high in their castes, as high as their coloring permits, and they both have excellent coloring. They do their work well. Chea's size may prevent her from becoming a chief, but I expect Jay to become chief judge in a few years. I thought you might have plans for them, she said, watching him. Did you order them to come with you on this trip? No, they insisted on coming. I should have ordered them to stay behind. So, she changed the subject abruptly. You have my word, Dayut, that no further action will be taken against you by me or my people. Do I have your word that my people will be accepted in your mountain dwelling, that they will become Tekon? You have my word, he said, and he felt as though the weight that he had left home to avoid had not only caught up with him, but had doubled before settling itself solidly on his shoulders. But he could not afford more uncertainty. His decision was made, and now, however difficult it proved to be, he had to stand by it. 1,500 Rohan would give up their homes and trek across desert and mountains to become Tekon. And this would happen because he had spoken a few words. He tried to balance his emotions, smooth away the yellow awe he felt, strangely combined with the luminescent blue of power. He could have made a brilliant green iridescence, but he controlled himself. Tahne watched Dayut closely, seeing the uncertainty that he probably thought he concealed. He did not inspire confidence. She sighed inwardly, glad that her plans did not depend on any particular ability of his. He would learn, and with her in his mountains with him, his pride would drive him to learn quickly. She got up and went to the door. Out of the corner of her eye she saw him get up too, his body tense. They had to trust each other personally before they could trust each other in any broader way. She had to be able to turn her back to him without fear of being attacked. He had to be willing to let her call in some of her people without fearing that they were being called to subdue him. She opened the door and called in Ehre and the chiefs of the 3 other castes. They trailed in, puzzled, and stood well away from Dayut. When they were in, Tahne spoke to another judge waiting with the crowd of fighters outside the door. Go to the surface and get the Tekon huntress and judge. Take enough fighters with you to ensure you're being able to bring them to me unhurt. The judge, a young female, flashed white assent, and Tahne closed the door. She turned to face her 4 caste chiefs, knowing already the outcry they would make as soon as she said what she had to say to them. The Tekon Hao and I have made our peace, she said. This is what we are going to do. She told them quietly, her voice even, her coloring muted as though in shadow. Muting made her blue less intimidating and freed people to speak their minds more easily. When she finished speaking, the 2 non-fighters, a male farmer and a female artisan, were a shade yellower than they had been when she began. Ehre and the chief hunter controlled their coloring but not their voices. You can't do this, Rokan Hao, Ehre said at once. Tahne ignored him. She answered questions and paid no attention to outbursts. The caste chiefs were the eyes, the ears, and the mouths of their respective castes. They brought Tahne the views and the large problems of their castes, and took back her decisions and pronouncements. Of course, any person could speak with Tahne, regardless of caste, but most people preferred to go through their caste chiefs. The blue made them secure, but when it came too close, it also frightened them. There was no similarity of coloring among the chiefs, thus there could be no challenging, no fighting, no matter what offenses were committed. Tahne had to keep order in a way that was not necessary in the more homogeneous council of judges. Her one rule was that an insult to another chief was an insult to herself. Her fairness in punishing offenders, fighter and non-fighter alike, enforced unusual equality in a society where normally no person was equal. Now Tahne waited while her chiefs, under this protection, asked their questions. "This is our home, Rokan Hao," the artisan said. "While there's still water, we should stay. The river might begin to fill again the day after we leave." "And it might not fill again at all," said Tahne. "We all know of dry places that were once riverbeds." "But our river isn't dry. No one is dying of thirst." "No one is dying of thirst yet," said Tahne. "But how long will it be before we are? Or will we die of hunger?" She looked at the farmer. She had spoken with him privately several times on this matter and knew exactly how bad the crop situation was. "We're harvesting now," the farmer said bitterly. "What there is to harvest, what the sun didn't kill, and what we had water enough to irrigate." He let his bright green fade to yellow. "There isn't enough to get us through the next year." Tahne let them all absorb that, then said, "Much of the game has migrated too." Everyone looked at the chief hunter, who was also beginning to yellow. "Fish has always been a delicacy with us," Tahne went on. "There has never been enough of it." "There could be more," said Ehre, "if both hunters and judges concentrate on it, and perhaps our methods of fishing need improvement." "The methods work," defended the chief hunter. "It is not our fault that the sea here is less productive than the land. Send your judges. They'll learn." "There is no fault," said Tahne. "We have a drought, and we have to move. That's all." "But we're desert people," said the chief hunter in a different tone. "Since the empire broke apart, our ancestors have lived on the desert. We should find another home here, where we belong." All three of the others flashed white agreement at once. "This is our home," asserted the artisan again. "It may be that we must leave this dwelling for a while, but why should we leave the desert? What do we know about living in the mountains?" "What we don't know, we'll learn," said Tahne. "We have an offer of sanctuary in the mountains. Which desert tribe would make us such an offer?" The drought was extensive, and her chiefs knew it. No desert tribe would be likely to welcome refugees now. "We're not hungry yet," said the hunter. "We're not weak. We don't have to go begging for what we need. We can take it." "So," Tahne looked at Ehre. This was something that she had discussed with him and all but decided to do. Until now. If we had to take from others to survive, we would do it. But now it's not necessary, and the fighters we would have lost need not die. The farmer spoke up. "But with 2 Hao, we wouldn't lose many. Our luck would change." Again there was general agreement. Tahne had been waiting for this. It was an expression of the kind of belief, the kind of faith, that made the people consider the Hao so essential. The Hao were supposed to possess some special ability to bring good to their people. It was not just that they tried to give good government, promote unity. Their mere presence was supposed to assure the people of good luck, fulfillment of their needs. Why else would a captive Hao, a bitter cripple, be better than no Hao at all? "Our luck has changed," said Tahne smoothly. "Because of the Tekon Hao, we'll have a new home with game, water, fertile land. You'll have 2 Hao working together for you willingly, and the toll that a captive Hao would have taken on his captors needs never be paid. There will be no more fighting, no more deaths." "No more deaths until we reach Dayut's mountains," said Ere, "until his people can overwhelm us." Tahne had to look at him to understand that although he faced her, he was actually speaking to Dayut, testing the young How as well as expressing his doubts. Dayut spoke up at once. "I have already given my word that my people will accept you peacefully." He came over to stand beside Tahne and face the chief judge. "You'll take your places among the Tekon and rise as high as your ability and your coloring will take you, or you will remain as low as your judgment can keep you." Dayut had not missed Ehre's too familiar use of his name rather than his title, and Ehre could not have missed the warning in Dayut's response. Tahne watched silently, curious, as Ehre was curious to see how Dayut handled people who were not blue, how far they could push him. She would prevent fighting, if necessary, though she did not think it would be necessary. Dayut knew that he was on trial before her chiefs. He might even realize that Ehre was testing him. At any rate, he would not be eager to kill the Rokan chief judge if such a thing could be avoided. Ehre would advance as far as Dayut permitted, then, with equal ease, retreat back as far as Dayut pressed him. It was no dishonor for a non-How to give ground before a How, and Ehre would find out what he wanted to know. Ehre looked at Dayut with respect, but without fear. "Tekon How," he said quietly. "I don't question your word. I only wonder if you can be certain that your people will be as willing as you are to keep the promise that you've made." Tahne watched Ehre now, remembering how little confidence Dayut had inspired in her earlier. It was important that her chiefs not feel what she felt. Dayut had to be able to display How superiority, whether he believed in it or not. He spoke mildly. "I'm an acknowledged How, chief judge. Why do you question my ability to govern?" Just right, Tahne thought. Retreat was the only escape from such a question. "I spoke too quickly, Tekon How." Ehre's voice was lower. "I did question, and I had no right. I meant no offense." "A chief judge should be less careless," said Dayut. "Speak carelessly again, and I'll accept your words as challenge." Ehre flashed white assent. Then, as his coloring darkened back to normal, the door opened and several judges carried Je and Chea into the room. The two were still securely tied. Their judge captors placed them on the floor before Tahne and left silently. When they were gone, Tahne spoke again to her chiefs. "You've all heard my decision. We're going. You will inform the people." The four accepted this, understood that the meeting was over. When Tahne, by her silence and muted coloring, had encouraged questions and argument, the chiefs had questioned and argued. Now, however, her tone told them that she had made her decision, and their protests ended. 3 of them filed out at once. Even Ehre stopped only long enough to ask if he could speak with her later. At her "yes," he turned and followed the others. As they left, Tahne went to one of the looms and from beside it took a weaver's knife. Handling the knife, she remembered that non-fighters had occasionally been known to use such tools on each other in anger. Being non-fighters, they had no standards of combat, no moral obligation to restrict themselves to only the body's natural weapons. Thus it would have been possible for a non-fighter to try to use such a tool on Dayut. It would have been an act of suicidal desperation, but it would have been possible. Tahne was glad it had not happened. She would have found it much harder to bargain with a How who had just killed one of the weakest of her tribe. She handed the knife to Dayut. He took it wordlessly and cut his huntress and judge free of their bonds. The two got up stiffly, rubbing arms and legs. They said nothing, apparently waiting for Dayut to tell them what had happened. He told them briefly, and as he spoke, Tahne watched their reactions with special interest. Je and Chea were to play an important part in her plans. It would be dangerous if they were actively hostile to the idea of a tie between the two tribes, but there was no sign of hostility in their manner. "And you have already given your word in this, Tekon Hao?" asked Je when Dayut was finished. "So," Dayut answered. Je seemed to think about it. "There's room," he said. "There's food and water." He glanced at Tahne. "And there are plenty of contentious fighters jealous of the places that they've already made for themselves." "One fighter may challenge another," said Tahne. But apparently she had missed something in the young judge's seemingly innocent words, something Dayut caught. Dayut spoke up quickly. "That's so. But the three of us, Je, will hold no grudge for what has happened to us here." He looked from Je to Chea, and Tahne saw by the looks that they gave back that he had guessed right. The two had been roughly handled, unfairly subdued by several Rohan, then humiliatingly displayed. Apparently they felt that they had debts to pay. Dayut spoke again firmly. "It should be clear to both of you that I'm buying our lives with this promise of sanctuary for the Rohan, and the Rohan Hao is buying assured survival for her people." The two flashed white assent, less grudgingly than Tahne would have expected. The huntress spoke for the first time. "Is there a part for us in this, Tekon Hao? Something you want us to do?" "There is something," said Tahne before Dayut could answer. She had decided that her plan would work. These two could play the role she had intended for them. "You and Je will prepare the way for my people. You will return to your mountains at once and let the Tekon know that we're coming, that they should prepare to meet us in peace." "We are to return home without the Tekon Hao?" Chea asked doubtfully. "The Tekon Hao will stay and guide us to our new home," answered Tahne. Tahne glanced at Dayut and saw that a small amount of yellow had crept into his coloring. Like his huntress and judge, Dayut was just learning this part of her plan, just coming to understand that it was his own presence as a hostage among the Rohan that would ensure Rohan's safe passage. Tahne was worried about her people's first contact with the Tekon. She believed Dayut meant his promise, but like Ehre, she worried about the immediate reaction of his people. They had been without a ruling Hao for too long. They might not be as quick to obey as they should be. Now, Tahne thought, Dayut could either pretend to have been aware of her plan all along and confirm her orders to Je and Chea, or he could contradict her, argue with her in front of them, and inevitably lose the argument. For the moment, Tahne was in the stronger position, and she meant to use that position to ensure the safety of her people. He spoke to her softly. "It seems, cousin, that you and your chief judge share similar doubts." She turned her head to look at him, but said nothing. The yellow, she noticed, was gone from his coloring. "In the end, you and your people take the greater risk," he said. "So, in the face of that, I'll accept the most immediate risk." He spoke to Je and Chea. "You'll go as the Rohan Hao has said. I'll follow later with the Rohan." The two flashed white. Tahne suppressed an impulse to let her own body whiten with pleasure. He had handled himself well with Ehre, and well again now. In his youth, he carried his uncertainty closer to the surface than she carried hers, but already he was learning. Tahne went to the door again, and when she opened it this time, she saw that her chiefs had already cleared away the crowd. In its place waited only the judges who had brought her, Je and Chea. She called in two of these and spoke to them. The Tekon huntress and judge will spend today and tomorrow with us as guests, free of any restraint. Tomorrow night they will be given whatever provisions they ask for and allowed to return to the mountains." Tahne waited until her judges flashed white. Then she looked back at Je and Chea. "Go with them now, back to your apartment. They'll see that you're not bothered." Je and Chea left silently. When they were gone, Tahne sat down wearily on one of the weaver's mats. "Well, little cousin, it begins." To her surprise, Dayut whitened with apparent amusement. It sounded more like it was almost over. She gave him a sidelong glance. "Do you know how little time it will take Ere to call a meeting of the Council of Judges? And how long it will take the council to argue our tie over and over pointlessly until they finally decide to do as I've ordered? And I must be present. The game must be played correctly. Then there will be the preparations, the actual moving. We're not a nomadic people, Dayut. It will be difficult." Dayut sat down beside her. "I'll do what I can to help," he said. "If, from now on, you'll give me some forewarning of your plans before you act on them." She looked at him, then sighed. "I've been a ruling How for a long time, cousin. Habit is strong." "I've just become a ruling How," he countered. "But I am the Tekon How, and I do intend to rule. You are a Tekon How. Now there are two of us." He flashed white. "Two How, Tahne. I won't be like your council of judges, merely deciding to do as you say." She stroked his shoulder, smoothing the fur down his arm. He amused her, but she felt a seriousness too. She spoke quietly. "I don't owe you this warning, cousin, but I'll give it to you anyway. Unless you're careful, you'll become exactly like my council of judges. You dislike responsibility. I'm accustomed to it. Think how easy it would be for you to become lax, satisfied, willing to enjoy the prestige of your coloring while doing nothing to earn it. That won't happen, Tahne." "But," she whitened slightly, "I've given you back your life. That's enough. What you do with it is up to you." As much warningly as affectionately, she reached over and caressed his throat. You've been listening to pre-1990s speculative fiction readings with a highlight on science fiction by Darrell T. Smith II. Please consider clicking the donation link in the description box. Thank you so much for your time and your imagination.